Okay, so what in the world is a Cold War, and how exactly do you fight one? This Powtoon will give you a very brief look at the 50-year Cold War that had lots of hotspots and almost led to World War III. Let's start with the basics. Who was involved? The Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it was a war of ideologies, economics, and government. The United States represented democracy, freedom, and capitalism, while the Soviet Union represented communism and socialism. Both sides accused the other of being evil, and both sides were determined to destroy the other and to spread their beliefs to as many countries as possible around the world. Our job was to eliminate the Soviets, their job was to eliminate us. We can say it all started at the end of World War II, but in reality the conflict between the US and the USSR started during the Russian Civil War, when the US, along with other Western nations, sent troops and supplies to help the White Army defeat Lenin's Red Army and stop the communists from taking control of the government. Fast forward to World War II, where the US and the USSR were unfriendly allies against Hitler. This just shows how bad Hitler was. He brought us together. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Soviet Army occupied Berlin, Eastern Germany, and most of Eastern Europe, and began establishing communist-backed puppet governments in Eastern European nations like Poland, even after they promised the US they would hold democratic elections. Afraid that communism would spread into a devastated Western Europe, the US and Britain stood firm and made every attempt to stop communism from spreading any further. What we have now is a face-off. Germany was divided into East and West, with the Soviets occupying the East and the US, British, and French occupying the West. What complicated this was the fact that Germany's capital, Berlin, was also divided in half. West Berlin, located in communist Eastern Germany, would be a free democratic city smack dab in a communist nation. Talk about a complicated situation. Former Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill will coin the phrase Iron Curtain in a speech describing the current state of Europe at the end of the war. This term would illustrate the divide between the communist Europe in the East and democratic Europe in the West. Containment quickly became the policy of the US in terms of communism. There was nothing the US could do about communism where it existed without risking a war, but they could take action to stop it from spreading elsewhere. To make it clear, in 1949 the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. This definitely meant that the United States couldn't risk war with the Soviet Union. The first real threat of the spread of communism beyond its post-war boundaries took place in 1947 in Greece and Turkey, as communist supporters attempted to take control of those governments with the support of Soviet weapons and the Russian Navy. In order to protect these countries, President Truman created what was known as the Truman Doctrine, promising $400 million in military and economic aid to any nation under the threat of communist takeover. President Truman said that it would be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The US was able to avoid any direct conflict with the Russians, and Greece and Turkey remained free of communist control. Seeing the benefits of economic support, Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a mass US aid package to European nations to help them rebuild following the war. Rebuilding the economies of Europe would help prevent the spread of communism. In total, the U.S. provided $13 billion in aid to these nations between 1948 and 1951. We even offered money to the Soviets and other nations under communist rule, but they rejected the offer, and the Soviet Union would not accept any of our money. Over the next 50 years, the Cold War will get hot. It started with Stalin's blockade of West Berlin and the Berlin airlift that followed. In 1950, the Korean War broke out as Communist North Korea and Democratic South Korea went to war. In 1960, communism spread to the Western Hemisphere as Cuba became a communist nation under the leadership of Fidel Castro. They were quickly supported by the Soviet Union. And staying with Cuba, the hottest spot of all was the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviets installed nuclear weapons in Cuba, the United States discovered it. We told them to remove them. They said no. President Kennedy created a blockade to stop Soviet troops, and the world came extremely close to the start of World War III. The Vietnam War was also a product of the Cold War, lasting from 1959 to 1975, and became the longest war in American history, and also one of the most controversial. The Cold War will last until 1989, and ended abruptly with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Created using Powtoon.